Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lancaster University Department of Education and webinar series. So today we have two of our PhD students in PhD in Education and Social Justice program. So this seminar will be live streamed for off-campus postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who can ask questions at the end of the presentation using their computer audio or via the chat box. The session will also be recorded and the recording will be available on the department website. So if you wish not to be recorded, please get in touch with us. So we'll make sure that your name or your photo is not included in the recording. I will ask all attendees to switch off their camera and mute their microphone during the presentation. And now I will introduce you two of our speakers today. Both are our PhD students in Education and Social Justice program. We have Sophia Kapcia, who is a specialist teacher of English with 20 years of teaching experience, and her background is in English language and literature, teaching at the secondary level and English curriculum and exam creation at both the primary and secondary levels. And Sophia is doing a thesis on intersectional pedagogies, and today she's going to present that. And we have a second speaker, Lee Mackenzie, who works as a researcher and lecturer in English at the Universidad del Norte Barranquilla, Colombia. He's currently based in Colombia, and he is going to present his PhD thesis on international development in English in higher education in Colombia. His research interests include language, human development, and language teacher education. So we have two presenters today. So each presenter will speak around 30 minutes. And after that, we'll have another 30 minutes for questions and answers. So I will now mute myself and stop my video, and the floor is Sophia's.
Okay, welcome everyone. So thanks for that, Melis. Melis has introduced me very well. So I'll just begin. So today I'm going to talk about intersectional pedagogy, its place in the English classroom. That is also going to be the topic of my thesis. I am from the Faculty of Education and Social Justice, and I've just put some contact details, my email and Twitter. If you wanted to contact me to discuss this further, that will be fine. So to begin, let's just put this in context and introduce the background behind this. So as was previously said, I have 20 years experience as an English language specialist at the secondary level. I was born in Jamaica, and, I'm actually telling my story because I think it is important to place and to cement my thesis, where I'm coming from. Why is this so important to me, intersectionality and intersectional practices, and why I think it should also be important as an important topic of discussion. So I have, as I said, my background is in secondary education, and primarily I had different roles in terms of raising the pupil premium, PP, and non-PP, non-pupil premium students, their attainment. And so as a result, when I started to research this, and I saw that in the research, the background linked, because it was saying, as Strand said, that there was still an inequity and a disparity there. Also, since 2012, the gap between low-income pupils' attainment at the end of primary school and the end of secondary school has widened, and this continues to widen. Previously, the research was really centered around Black Caribbean boys and their underattainment. And then it shifted. There was a shift to white working class boys. So we have so much research on boys and their attainment. And then, of course, there is that issue of the inequity that exists in not only in the classroom, but in the English classroom. There's still a big gap between race, class, and gender. So that was the background, so to speak. So my research is focused on intersectionality. And, you know, there has been a lot of buzz around this. From Kimberly Crenshaw started to, from she coined the term and she started to do her research on this, it has been used in numerous ways. For example, in social science, to decipher social categories such as gender, ethnicity, and class, or to examine differences and similarities within social categories, or to focus on multiple intersecting inequalities between social categories. So it is used in numerous ways. Okay, so what is the objective of my study? My study focuses both on inequity and inequality. And I think this is important to look at that, because it's not just the inequality that exists, there's also inequity. It examines how English teachers address inequalities in education and how teachers use their knowledge of intersectionality and the practices, and how they look at gender, race, and class and respond to that in order to raise students' achievement and therefore cement their success in education. Gap, and what when I went through, what did I see as a gap in the literature? So it was limited. I found initially that, oh, well, how am I going to get all the literature? It was limited in the sense that the research on the relationship between teachers, explicit understanding and practical knowledge of intersectionality, of race, of class, of gender, and also the impact of this on achievement and success of pupils in English lessons. And then what knowledge do teachers have and how is this applied? That was also limited. So the availability of intersectional pedagogies in terms of the techniques and strategies for teaching and learning within the English classroom was limited. So simply put, the question of what intersectional pedagogy would look like in the context of an English classroom was a really marked question when I went through. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to now just briefly go through the research problem, the rationale, which I think I have touched on the rationale for the study, the research design, and the theoretical framework. Okay, so the research problem, as I said, I wanted to really zoom in on how teachers are using intersectional pedagogy within their classroom, and if they were in fact using it, and how much knowledge they have had of this, and also how they could correctly apply intersectional practices in order to raise their students' attainment. In order to do this, I adopted a theoretical approach in this thesis to distinguish that it's not satisfactory only to focus on race, gender, or social background inequalities. As an alternative, there must be a focus on the multiple identities that combine to produce what McCall calls complex inequality. So this study is positioned within an intersectional framework, and it is important because it considers the combination of different attributes such as race, such as class, such as gender, and examines how they interact and become separate disadvantaging factors which may intersect at different points to create different power relationships. So I think I just did that one. So Intersectionality allows us to look at the constructs in society, such as race, class, and gender, intersectionally. I think that is important. And also to focus on the multiple identities that combine to contribute to these, what McCall refers to as complex inequality. It also examines how our multiple identities interact and become separate. And it also highlights the impact of race and racism on marginalized groups and the quest for social justice. And when I go through some of the analysis of the findings, we look at that. So researchers talk a lot about, these researchers, about intersectional pedagogy, right? And they postulate that it's important for teachers to have an intersectionally aware teacher identity. And this concept of identity and how teachers take their identities within the classroom and how that impinges on students' learning, it's also something that the research underlines or even brings some light to. Ferber and Herrera argue that the absence of intersectional pedagogies have the potential of doing more harm than good for pupils from marginalized backgrounds because they can further isolate and invalidate these pupils. And I have put that idea within today because when I went through my findings, one of the things that came through was that teachers had thought that one drawback of using intersectional pedagogy was that they could be seen as stereotyping. And as a result, instead of embracing intersectional pedagogy, they were very tentative to use it. And when you look at this argument, this idea that the absence of this is not helping because it could create isolation, it could create a lot of maybe disenfranchised or disengagement with students. And then Berger believed that intersectional pedagogy encourage pupils and their social literacy, which will allow pupils to increase their ability to recognize internalized oppression and the confines of singular viewpoints and the cost of dominance. And the English curriculum, within the English curriculum, we have a lot of scope to have discussions on oppression and these topics that are really big topics, such as racism and the visibility or lack of visibility of girls in terms of some girls in the research. It came out that some girls, within a classroom setting, they were there, but their voices, they allow the voice to dominate. And it could be that they had some internalized oppression. They felt that they would be okay to just be quiet and not have their voices heard. So what was the methodology? Okay, so I had a focus group and I also had, so the focus group, I had 2 sessions lasting for an hour and I had 4 teachers in each session. And then we also had interviews. So the sample size was 20 English teachers. The interviews were semi-structured interviews with closed and open questions. Right. Just sharing my research question so you can see what I looked at. So I had 2 research questions. And so the first one was, to what extent does the intersectionality of class, race, and gender affect pupils' achievement and attitude to English? Then what factors influence attainment in English classes? How can teachers implement strategies to tackle the problem of differential attainment in English classes? And to what extent do teachers use intersectional pedagogy to challenge the structure of race, class, and gender in their classes to ensure pupil attainment? So the research findings. So we're moving on to the nice bit where you can hear some of what came out. So what teachers say about intersectionality. So, and I have just put some direct quotes so you can get a feel of what was said. So they don't fit into one box, and so this is a teacher referring to the students. They don't fit into one box because it's a whole overlap of different circumstances. So here you can see that, yes, teachers are aware that pupils come in with multiplicity of identities, different circumstances. Another teacher said, but it's not that easy in terms of teaching and learning to, in a way, sort of like, discriminate in that way and put everyone. So, this is going to work for all, Black students. So the challenges within teaching and learning and really trying to get and increase pupil attainment, but not isolating and not, including all students so that they're a part and not putting people, as this teacher said, in a box. There's some of a mixture in terms of political, economic, social, and so in terms of race, gender, class, disability, and they all overlap. Then and then that becomes a child. And I like the way that, we're looking at all these identities and how a child can come into the classroom, not just as an SEN child. And I was just recently talking to a colleague about when you look on the websites of schools, you see they have a clear SEN policy, but there isn't any other policy in terms of inclusion. So in terms of inclusion, SEN is there and it's cemented, but in terms of the other policies to be inclusive, such as intersectional practices, because an SEN child will have other identities, other factors, there'll be gender, class, race, which all comes together and overlap. And the last one, there's not one way you can identify students, and that sums it up. What came out as well was teachers believe that in order to be intersectional and in order to cement intersectional practices within a teaching environment, within an English classroom, there must be cultural understanding of people's backgrounds. So teachers must have a cultural understanding of where their peoples are coming from and have some empathy around that. So one teacher summed it up as, when we go into a classroom as English teachers, right, we have obviously the knowledge of teaching English to students, but I think one of the things that teachers, English teachers, not just English teachers, all teachers lack is an understanding of the people's background and understanding of specifically cultural backgrounds. So that was something that I saw recurring within the data and when I started to look at the findings. So the importance of intersectional pedagogy to classroom practice was also discussed. And so the English curriculum, this question came up, does it allow an intersectional approach? So the English curriculum, does it? And one teacher put it like this. The teachers all spoke about the GCSE curriculum, English curriculum, not being fit for purpose. And they believed it wasn't fit for purpose because pupils don't care about Shakespeare, they don't care about poetry, they don't care about this And why they don't care about it is not because it is not important, but it's because there's no connection. So teachers aren't saying that poetry and Shakespeare and literacy and the literature isn't important. What they were saying was there wasn't the connection, the link that tied in to what the students were going through each and every single day. So their own personal experience. So it created almost something of a disconnect and therefore perpetuated disengagement and unattainment. Another teacher said, obviously not, because there's no identity. It doesn't identify with so many sectors of the community. For the Black kids, we don't have any Black poets or Black writers in there. For the Asian kids, there's so many fantastic writers and, books and things like that. And teachers did say that because the Key Stage 3 curriculum had more scope, it allowed you to put in more authors of your choice, then it was more favorable than the GCSE, the Key Stage 4 curriculum that was quite set and quite rigid. And so the next one. So we talk about why those things aren't in the GCSE curriculum. So this question, the teacher was saying, how do we ensure that we're trying to cater or marry up the two, intersectionality or intersectional practices, with what we do have, the English curriculum? So talking about why those things aren't in the GCSE, and they understand, so the students understand that, and actually quite often they feel strongly about that. I mean, obviously with the more modern poetry, they have made an effort to make it more multicultural, but even then, the students will understand that it's not available. And actually, some of the poets themselves deal with this whole idea of not valuing different cultures and not valuing where people come from and prioritizing one thing over another and all that kind of stuff. So, the scope to discuss what is happening and the situation. And then another teacher said, at GCSE, we look at Blood Brothers. That's a set text on the English curriculum. And obviously there's massive class lines that go through that. Sadly, with some of the other GCSE stuff, our hands are tied, aren't they? Because, Shakespeare, you can't do anything with that. The vast majority of the poetry is written by old white men. But actually, to talk about that with the students and say, actually, the reason that there's not a lot of, early female poetry that we're seeing is because, actually, people don't necessarily think that was important to educate women to be able to produce their own literature and things like that. So, and I like what's coming out, that whole discussion, educating students about what is currently happening in society. And these are big topics. Okay, so what teachers say about the benefits of intersectionality? And I'm going to skip through some of these because I want to get to the focus group. So I'll do one. So the idea that teachers need to deliberately embed these practices within their teaching. And it can't be by chance. And some of the teachers did say that they don't deliberately use intersectional practices. Well, before being invited to take part in the research, they didn't prior to that really consciously thought about it. So how to differentiate the curriculum? Because that's something, initially I was only going to do interviews, but then after talking to my supervisor, Melis, it became important to do a focus group as well. I wanted for this research, for this study to be something that teachers could use they could say, okay, I can use this, I can take this away and make my practice better. So I spoke about the identity, and I will touch on this because teachers talked about identity and their identity being so important to ensure that intersectionality is in their classroom. One teacher said, and I use Steve Jobs, he said, so this is a quote from him, "The storyteller is the most powerful person in the world." And in fact, if you think about that, I look at my students, how engaged they get when I start to talk about aspects of my life, where I was brought up, where I was born, coming from Jamaica, coming here, having a family, being a mom with 5 girls. They love that. They get really engaged. And also, saying, okay, if Miss can do this, then I can do as well. So teachers becoming models by sharing their story, not just expecting students to buy in. So one teacher summed it up nice, and she said that one way that I've tried to overcome that is bioeducation, number one, teaching them. And I think the fact that I'm from South Africa, I use that a lot in terms of helping, especially that particular topic of racism. I use the fact of my background, where I'm from, and how I've addressed it, on how our countries addressed it in South Africa, try and get them to understand that I'm not saying that that's a magic formula for everything, but it's another thing that I do, is to build relationships with the students. So telling your story builds relationship. I'm moving on to the intersectional practices that teachers in the study believed would effectively embed intersectionality in their classroom practice. So, thinking about key stage 4, if you're planning your curriculum, what would you include in the scheme of work? And the teachers believe that these were things that must and should be there. So oracy topics and big topics such as race, class, and gender, foreground those topics within your classroom discussions. Get different opportunities to discuss these, so students are aware of different races, different practices, different customs, and also the students who or represent these races, these classes, these genders will feel embraced and welcome because we're acknowledging them within our practice. They talked about using multimodal text. So you're using different texts. So you could use a written text. You could use a text, an audio text. You could use a video as well. So that would link to the different ways that students learn. They talked about looking at societal role reversal, and one video, the Bridgertons, would be something that you could use, and that's a video. And then another text, multimodal text that looks at this role reversal in society is Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman. And a lot of schools do use Noughts and Crosses for their year 9 or year 8 as well, using different images. And these images ensure that these images are reflective of the students in your classroom. So you have girls, you have boys, you have different races as well, using different genres as well. So having complaint letters, informal, formal language, having transactional writing, also linking that to real life skills and skills that they need in the future, they thought was really important. Talking about financial aspects of life as well and linking that. And as you see, the English classroom does embrace every other subject. I remember when I was training and my lecturer said that, and it is in fact true, because in an English classroom, you can link a maths lesson, geography, science, you name it.
Sophia, you have 3 minutes left. So
3 minutes. Okay, yeah. I'm coming down. Okay, so they also talked about cultural capital and giving students the opportunity to go on enrichment opportunities, to maybe invite a local writer or poet within the school, and ensuring that it's different races, different genders as well. Also inviting local business people into school to raise aspirations among pupils. They also talk about having entrepreneurial skills as well, and linking that to British values. They talked about career paths and looking at, the British values, tolerance, responsibility, democracy, liberty, respect, law, and embedding that within the classroom. Community relationships was something that they thought was important. So you're connecting the different communities and relating that to the modern day experiences. They also thought that talking about ageism was something that was important as well. And the last bit is the terminology. So they believe that having different vocabulary, so some schools had tiered vocabulary, so you look at, and the tier 1, 2, and 3 looked at different levels, how sophisticated the vocabulary could get. And within that, you would have words such as discrimination, prejudice, oppression, etc. Okay, I know that we're going to have questions. My last slide. Thanks for listening. And of course, afterwards, I'll be here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was really a fascinating presentation. There's so much food for thought, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions. It was really amazing. I'm having a proud supervisor moment now. So we're moving to Lee Mackenzie, and he'll present his thesis on higher education, Colombia, English and international development. So Lee, floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Just please send me a message in the chat box if there are any problems with the sound, because obviously I don't know if you can hear me well or not. I'm here in rural Colombia, so I'm on the side of a mountain, so hopefully I've done my best. I bought a generator to ensure that there are no more power cuts, but I never know here in Colombia. I'm always surprised. Okay, so can everybody see my screen? Hello?
Yes, we can see, Lee, but would you like to press F5 so we can get the entire screen? Because now we can see your notes as well.
Sorry, it's...
We can see your screen, but maybe you should go to the first one. We can see your notes as well.
Right, hang on.
We have time, don't worry. Okay,
you shouldn't see my notes now.
Yes, exactly. Now, yes, theorizing English, yeah, perfect.
Okay, so this topic is broadly situated within a growing body of literature on the relationship between English and development. And the purpose of the research I conducted for my PhD thesis was to look at how English language education in Colombian higher education contributes to or stifles human development. But I don't have time to talk about all of that. So we're just going to look today at how English contributes to disadvantage in Colombia. And these are the specific things I will aim to do today. Okay, I don't have much time, so I'm not going to read from slides to save time. I think you can read faster than I can speak. So the question driving this presentation is this one. I'm interested in the interface between English and development in the Global South. And as I work in Colombia, it made sense to explore this relationship in this context. But it's also a very interesting context because of the historic links with the United States, which has shifted perceptions of English in Colombia. And as you can probably guess, the capability approach helped me to frame this question. And I also use this framework to help interpret the data. So why is such research needed? There are several reasons. A lot of the research into English and development in the Global South looks at the economic value of English, rather than the value of English for individuals in their lives that go beyond that. So I was interested in doing studies at the micro level. Another reason to do such research is that for some reason, education systems in the Global South, particularly in Latin America, there have been several national English language programs. In Chile, British Council was involved in a big project in Uruguay, Plan Ceibal, which was, according to the person who implemented it, who I spoke to, a disaster. And there have been similar projects in Ecuador and Peru, and also in Colombia. It's also even on the university admissions exams in Brazil and Colombia, which is interesting. So yeah, throughout Latin America, there has been a push to increase the levels of English proficiency. And from looking at the documents, policy documents from the different governments in different countries in Latin America, it again seems to be the economic value of English. So it's said to contribute to development in terms of employment or other economic benefits. So English in the region seems to have a predominantly instrumental value. And again, there's not much research on this looking at how it affects the lives of individuals. Just to mention one other point, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Common European Framework, but A1 is the lowest level, C2 is the highest level. And it's interesting that the Common European Framework, although it's European, is widely used in Latin America, and university graduates in Ecuador and Colombia are expected to achieve a B1 level, which is about intermediate, or let's say conversational level in English, a bit more than conversational level. Okay, the research context specifically, English in higher education in Colombia, which is the context that I researched. How did English disadvantage or advantage higher education graduates in Colombia? So English is a ubiquitous in Colombian higher education, and it's included, as I mentioned on the previous slide, it's included on the university admissions and exit exams. And it's not just for universities, it's for other higher educational institutes. So if you want to be a plumber or an electrician, or if you want to be a dairy farmer, you have to learn English. It's compulsory, you can't get out of it, and you often have to pay to learn English in addition to the cost of your studies. And one impact of this is that some students have needed longer to complete their studies, or they have failed to graduate because of poor fluency in English. At my university, you cannot get your graduation certificate, your degree, until you have passed all the English levels. And this disproportionately impacts economically disadvantaged students, since they typically have much lower English language proficiency when entering higher education than their more privileged counterparts. One reason for this is that The students that have a lot of money, they go to private schools, which are not always, but typically of better quality than the public schools, the state schools. Although some low-end private schools maybe are quite similar to public schools with a few differences, like the student numbers might be lower. But the high-end private schools typically teach a bilingual program, so there are courses in English and courses in Spanish. So by the time that the students from wealthy backgrounds go to university, their English level tends to be pretty good. And those who went to public schools tend to have zero English or very limited competence in English. Okay, so now you have some basic information about the research context. I'm just going to introduce the theoretical framework. And the three concepts from the capability approach, which I have time to briefly look at, are capabilities. So the advantage of capabilities is that it supports a multi-dimensional analysis of the relationship between English and advantage. So it goes beyond purely the economic dimension of the value of English and allows us to look at other dimensions of the value of English in the global South. And yes, it allows us to conceptualize development in terms of the expansion of human freedoms. And in the capability approach, each person is treated as an end rather than as a means to some other end. The second concept, which is useful for helping to understand the data, is agency. And this allows us to view individuals not as passive recipients of the fruits of cunning development programs, but as active participants in their own destiny. Human agency is a critical element of well-being. And it is important because it helps us to view participants not as victims of circumstance, but as individuals who can shape their opportunities as agents, not patients. And the third concept I have time to look at is the concept of conversion factors. These help us to shed light on the barriers that individuals face as a result of English language education in Colombian higher education. If we know what problems they're having with converting their resources into functionings, then that's very useful information for policymakers, obviously, and can point to reasons why different individuals may struggle to turn their English language skills to their advantage. So as I mentioned, students from private schools tend to have better English than students from public schools. So the outcome or the functioning when they get to university is different. And it's interesting to look at the reasons for that. One reason is public schools, but obviously there are more reasons. Okay, very few studies use the capabilities approach to look at the role of English in development. There's probably about 10 studies in total by about 4 or 5 different authors that have used the capability to approach to look at the role of English in development. So this is a very, very new field within the English and development field. A focus on the value of English at the micro level is very new. There's quite a bit on language economics and how, as I said, English has an economic value. And maybe because of this, English is under-theorized within the capability literature. So to help in this theorization, I draw on the writings of Nussbaum and Sen and others within the capability approach to try to kind of theorize what is English within the capability approach? How can English be understood within the capability approach? So I scoured the writings of Nussbaum for her comments on English or languages, and this was probably the best quote that I found from her. So from a cosmopolitan perspective, learning languages is a very positive thing. But she doesn't say anything here about English, but she certainly advocates for teaching other languages than the mother tongue of students. In terms of Sen's view of English or languages, well, he often refers to India, where English has a different role from the role of English in Colombia. And in a very short YouTube video, he says that English helps economic integration as well as international relations in Colombia. He also says that language is central to human existence and our identity. So he sees that it has more than just an economic or instrumental value. And in his work with Dreze, don't know how to pronounce that, Dreze, he has written more extensively on English. So I'll just give you a few seconds to read this quote. So Sen and Dreze, they clearly have no illusions about the negative role of English in India. And I think this is an important point. English expands opportunities for some and limits opportunities for others. Elsewhere in the capability research, some scholars have only touched on the role that English can play in human flourishing and in education systems. For example, Tickley and Wilson-Stridham say insufficient levels of competence in the language of instruction can adversely affect university access and participation and can stifle development of Nussbaum's list of central capabilities. Interestingly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I've checked this, Nussbaum's central capabilities do not mention language explicitly. I think they refer to literacy, which is different from speaking a language. So you can be illiterate but still speak a foreign language. Adamson and Tamim, who have used the capability approach to look at the role of English in the Global South, say that English acts as a social stratifier because proficiency in this language strongly correlates with socioeconomic status. And as I've been saying, this is similar in Colombia. And one factor in this is private schooling, which tends to have more resources and better English language teachers because they pay more than the public sector. Okay, next slide. So finally, some other capability scholars have written that the lack of English proficiency can represent a capability obstacle to aspirations achievement. So we saw on the previous slide how level of English or lack of competence in English can be an issue. And again, this is repeated here. And interestingly, Kalitz and Gore and Walker say that English speakers can face marginalization because of their accent or low level of English. And this is also true in Colombia. When I teach my classes and my students have had a Colombian teacher, they often mock that Colombian teacher's English accent. They seem to think that a native speaker is somehow better, which is obviously rubbish. But there is that language ideology present in Colombian society. And this last comment is quite interesting because it helps us to theorize English from a capability perspective. The internal capability of English cannot become a combined capability without interaction or practice. There is some debate about whether an internal capability is actually a capability. Robbins says that it is not. So if you prefer the term innate capability, that's also a way of conceptualizing it. Okay. Right. So the important point about this is that you need the right conditions to be able to develop the internal capability. So as we said, proficiency in English can be a capability obstacle. And if you don't have the right conditions to develop that capability, then obviously that's not going to lead to capability expansion. Okay, so what are the implications of this theorization of English as a linguistic capability? I would say that English can be understood as a relational capability. The concept of relational refers to the interaction of social factors with individuals' capabilities. And language capabilities, I would argue, are relational because what counts as a sufficient level of competence for achieving important functionings depends on the context. So when I lived in Switzerland, I was teaching primary school teachers so that they had a C2 level of English. But a primary school teacher here in Colombia would probably only require an A1 level of English. So the value of that English depends on the competence level that you have in that language, and that varies from context to context. It's also relational because, as I mentioned, speakers can face, or teachers can face, marginalization because of their English accent or level of proficiency. And if you are a non-native speaker, you may have experienced this. I think there's also a lot of accentism within the UK. I come from the north and I've lost a lot of my accent because I got the feeling that it wasn't received well when I spoke with a thick Geordie accent like. So for these reasons, I would argue that languages are relational. The other reason that it can be relational is that this capability cannot normally be practiced in isolation. If you lock somebody in a room for 15 years during their childhood, when they come out, they will not speak the language. So it requires interaction, going back to the point about internal capabilities and combined capabilities. Okay. Another factor to consider is that linguistic capabilities differ in terms of robustness. And this concurs with the Council of Europe, which developed the Common European Framework, which stated that the process of language learning is continuous and individual. No two users of a language, whether native speakers or foreign learners, have exactly the same competencies or develop them in the same way. So if you look at language acquisition theory, everybody has a unique interlanguage, a unique language. Not everybody has exactly the same vocabulary or English knowledge. And everybody's language skills are in a state of development, or the opposite if you don't have opportunities to speak or practice English. So I think Comim calls certain types of capabilities becomings because they represent a process of something which is becoming something else and shouldn't be viewed as something static. Okay. So I would argue that the linguistic capability is in various stages of development and varies from person to person. I would also argue that just as an individual's level of education can promote different degrees of human flourishing, so too may her level of English. And since proficiency in English correlates positively with financial resources, viewing English as a process, capability, or as a becoming may call attention to other injustices. So if we know that somebody's capability to speak English is low compared to somebody else's, that may indicate some injustices. So just to remind you of the research question which guides this presentation, what barriers do economically vulnerable Colombians in higher education face when developing the capability to communicate in English? So I'm not going to look at how English promotes development, although that's the main focus of my thesis. I'm just going to look at the barriers that students faced. And I specifically focused on students from low-income backgrounds and what problems they had learning English. I interviewed 20 people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And I've used pseudonyms. Obviously, ethical procedures were followed, but I also had to translate most of these interviews because the level of English that they had was so low that we couldn't do the interviews in English in all but 4 of the cases. Okay, so broadly speaking, the interview data showed that almost all participants had very low levels of the capability to communicate in English when entering their respective higher education institutes. Many of these participants were placed in English classes alongside wealthier, more proficient students. All participants reported that the quality of English language education was low across higher education institutes, whether they were private or public. And few participants obtained the expected B1 exit level of proficiency. So the target was not met in most cases. So let's look at some extracts of English and how this has led to disadvantage or gave rise to disadvantage. This is a quote from Theo, who is a public university degree graduate in modern languages. I'll just give you a moment to read it. So this quote, I think, shows how linguistic disadvantage, in this case, poor English proficiency, can exacerbate the disadvantage experienced by students from lower socioeconomic strata when commencing post-compulsory education. In particular, the incipient nature of Theo's capability to communicate in English made it more difficult for him to participate in English language education on an equal footing with his wealthier classmates. It also increased his workload and stress and constrained his capability for voice. As this quote also shows, wealthier students had more opportunities to interact in English as they had the economic means to pay for private tuition. The Colombo American Institute is a binational organization, and the British Council is from the UK, and they are, as you might expect, quite expensive. And I would argue they are cashing in on English fever in the global South. Okay, so this is another quote. This is from Katrina, who graduated from a private university with a degree in industrial engineering. Sadly, her experience of substandard English language education was the norm rather than the exception. As I've said, graduates of all types of higher education institutes, be they private or public, high-end, low-end, commented on the low quality of English language education they experienced during their higher education careers. As this quote shows, one consequence of low quality English language education is truancy. So this is another way in which English leads to disadvantage. It can demotivate students and make them not want to go to class. Related to truancy is also desertion. So this quote from Samuel, who graduated from a public university with a degree in social sciences, shows that he just stopped attending his classes because he didn't have the time. As I said, in addition to studying their core subjects, they also have to take English, whether they want to or not. And that obviously constrains their capability of autonomy as well. So I would say that from the interview data, unrobust levels of the English language capability can constrain the capability for voice and inhibit equitable participation. It can lead to desertion and truancy. It can negatively impact learners' grades and motivation, and it can result in increased levels of anxiety and stress. And if we had viewed the English language capability in binary either or terms, either you have it or you don't, I think this would obscure these injustices. It's only by looking at the different levels of the capability that individuals have that we can try to uncover the reasons for that and expose injustices. And I would say that viewing the English language capability as relational and in a process of development is important, since a low amount of this capability is more likely to lead to capability deprivation if other members of the linguistic environment are more proficient. So if everybody in the class speaks better English than you, it's obviously going to lead to disadvantage. And that is the same within society. So thinking about the UK context, immigrants who don't speak a good level of English are likely to face a lot more disadvantage because of their poor English skills. In Colombia, it's also a problem in the education system. So viewing English as a process capability, which in the case of economically vulnerable students may be underdeveloped compared to wealthier students, begs the question as to why this is the case. And I've already given some reasons for this. And the data bears this out. So one factor is the differential instruction that poor and non-poor students receive prior to entering higher education. And all but 3 of the participants attended public schools, and even those who attended private schools did not go to high-end private schools and did not attend private schools for the entirety of their compulsory education. And the data showed that there are more opportunities to be exposed to and practice English in the private sector. There are more hours allocated to English. The pedagogy tends to be more communicative, so there's more group work and pair work and more opportunities for learners to speak. Okay.
Lee, you have 5 minutes left just to wrap up the presentation.
Okay. So one quotation which highlights the poor quality English language instruction that this study's economically disadvantaged students receive during their compulsory education is provided by Jorgelis, who graduated from a public university with a degree in economics. So I'll just give you a moment to read this. So as Jorgelis explains here, private bilingual schools are expensive and were therefore beyond the budget of most of this studies participants. As I said previously, 3 participants attended private schools for some of their schooling, but they all had to transfer to public schools for economic reasons. One of these participants is Luna, and her experience is illuminating because it clearly highlights the contrast in standards between the public and the private sectors. So this is the quote from Luna. I'll just give you a moment to read this. So Luna graduated from a private university with an MA in social development, and she shows here that one reason for the poor quality of English language education in public schools is teacher absenteeism. And this was corroborated by several other participants. So in public schools, one reason is the lack of staff. Public schools, teachers sometimes don't even come to class. Another reason is the amount of classroom time allocated to English. So according to the Colombian Ministry of Education, public school pupils should receive 3 hours a week of English, which is more than Luna was supposed to receive, even if her teachers had been present. So I hope this highlights one key aspect of linguistic capabilities, which is the importance of practice and exposure. But in public schools, the consensus was that opportunities for exposure and practice were very limited. And the findings that the standard of English instruction in public schools is low supports findings from elsewhere in the global south, which show a negative relationship between poverty and English proficiency. So I hope this shows that not only is the diffusion of English in Colombia implicated in injustices, it also highlights the importance of financial circumstances for developing the capability to communicate well in English. And this is highlighted by Mariluz, who I've skipped, sorry, who told me the following. Yeah, so this term, we have to settle for what's on offer. This is very, very common in Colombia, that people have learned not to expect anything better. So Mariluz here seems to have internalized the logic that an education which is paid for directly is superior to an education which is funded indirectly through taxes. And it shows the extent to which quality education is seen as a privilege of the wealthy in Colombia. Given that participants' access to better quality schools was limited for economic reasons, it's perhaps not surprising that this can lead individuals to adapt their preferences to unjust conditions. So by restricting participants' educational choices to public schools of generally low quality, economic situation intersects with low quality English language education in both compulsory and higher education to constrain the development of the English language capability. So in sum, the interview data showed that individuals without the means to attend the better resourced private schools, which allow more opportunities for practice and exposure, are more likely to experience linguistic disadvantage when entering higher education. In line with other studies, there appears to be a relationship between household income and the level of proficiency in English. And despite this, all participants eventually passed their English classes and graduated. And just to leave on something positive, educational resilience was instrumental in enabling participants to catch up with their more proficient peers. And I'll leave you with this quote from Theo, which demonstrates this, I think. So this quote shows how Theo had to negotiate barriers both inside and outside the classroom in order to claim the same amount of the capability to communicate in English as his wealthier peers. However, Theo's dream was to become proficient in English, so he was able to use his resilience to associate with high-performing students, and a bicycle helped him to navigate the geographical obstacles he faced. So this, as this example indicates, conversion factors can interact to shape the English language capability, in complex and person-specific ways. So that's kind of it. I would just like to share with you one thing, if I may.
Yes, of course.
I'll just put it in the chat box. Oops, sorry.
Okay.
It's just an article that was published, and it goes into more depth on some of the issues that I have been discussing today. So if you're interested in any further reading on this, please go to the link in the chat box. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lee. That was a great presentation with rich insights from your participants. And I know that there's much more than that in your also thesis, which you weren't able to, of course, present in 30 minutes, but some of the discussions in your thesis were touching on linguistic imperialism, and there's a complex conceptualization of linguistic imperialism with linguistic capability, and then you have all those debates on massification of higher education coming in. And huge congratulations for your article. I'm sure many of our students and staff will be reading it, and it's just like published only a week ago. So huge congrats. And that's the one thing about our PhD students, that they start publishing early on. So thank you very much, both of you. I'm having a really very proud supervisor moment here, that showing sharing your amazing work, and with in a department seminar and listening to you is just it's really great, and I'm really so proud with both of you. So I'm just going to open the floor for discussions and questions. So since we're only 18 people, I would suggest that, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask directly to Lee and Sophia. So I will, rather than writing on the chat box. So anyone who has a question? Maybe we can all, if you want, of course, you can turn on your videos too. Exactly, Jen. I agree. That's just like a mind-blowing seminars and going on. So anyone who wants to keep the discussion with a question? If not, I will start with maybe one question to Sophia first. So Sophia, thank you very much again for this fantastic presentation. So one of my questions is you were talking about, intersectional pedagogies and so on, but I'm wondering to what extent actually teachers were using intersectional pedagogies, or how did they come to realize the importance of intersectional pedagogies? Because this is not something necessarily embedded in teacher training. The teacher training does not necessarily teach them about the importance of using this intersectionality. Did they talk about how did they come to realize and practice and learn about intersectional pedagogies?
Okay, thanks for that question, Melis. I kind of touched on it when they said they didn't deliberately, they had like a wow moment. Oh yes, this is what I do, sort of. And that thread went through the interviews like, okay, Sophia, before I didn't really know about this, but you've given me all this information beforehand. So before the interviews, I sent out the document with all the research questions, what it was about, and also the definitions of intersectional pedagogy and intersectionality. So they had that before the interviews. They also had the interview questions, and I think that helped them to prepare and really think about their practice in terms of those concepts. So when we had the interview, they did confess that, I don't really I'm not doing this deliberately. I don't do it in the lesson, but I think this is how I try to be inclusive. So a lot of teachers, addressed it in terms of how they use inclusion within their classroom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Kinmi, yes, please.
I can ask question to Lee. So thanks for, both of your presentations were wonderful, but personally, grown up in Korea, which has crazy English focus, that I kind of can hear what's going on in Lee's presentation. So my question is, the comment, first of all, is that I think what English does to Korean students in higher education, it's exactly the same as you described in Colombia. And I think the concern, it's even more concerning because it really makes salient of the people's differences from their background. Before speaking English, actually, it's kind of, they can hide where they're coming from if they want. But as soon as they have to speak out English, that's immediately people hear their accent and level of English proficiency. That's really bad. But my question is more like, because you kind of employed the theoretical lens, which is agency. And I notice a lot of Korean students do a lot of things to kind of get over it or overcome it. So they've been creative in terms of learning English in their own way, which is very cheap, especially nowadays that have opportunity to do so. So I'm just wondering if any of the data that you, or any observation that you have in terms of students actually use their own active agency to get over that disadvantage they're coming from.
Thanks for the question. Yes, South Korea, there's some interesting work being done in the South Korean context. There's a guy, I think, called Park, who talks about neoliberalism, and he just describes quite a frustrating state of affairs where everybody seems to be pushed to learn English, and the standards keep getting higher and higher and higher. So, I tried to give an example there of Theo, who he was one of the success stories from the 20 people that I interviewed. I would say about a quarter had become fairly proficient in English. 4 of the people that I interviewed agreed to do the interview in English. The other 16 didn't feel comfortable enough with their English. So those 4 success stories are all interesting, because what it showed was, and I've experienced this myself, the wealthy students, when they get to university, they stop trying. Because they think, oh, well, my English is so much better than everybody else's, because their parents go to the States. And when they go to the States, they're the translator for their parents, so they think that they have this, well, compared to the other people in the class, they do have a very good level of English. So they stop coming to class, they stop trying, they do the bare minimum. And then the students that know that their English is poor, they're the ones that apply themselves and work with. So it does kind of balance out. And Theo's actually overtook most of his students in his class. So he started worse than them. But by the time he finished, his English was better. And he now works as a public school English teacher and has worked in the States and in Brazil as a teacher. So there are success stories, but I think 4 out of 16 is maybe not a success.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. So we have Thomas Krab.
Sorry. Yes, hello. Thank you Hi, thank you to both of our presenters today. It's really, really interesting. My question's actually for Lee, because his research and mine intersect quite a lot. I'm doing similar work in a different context. But yeah, Lee, I was wondering, with the capabilities approach, did you ask the participants in your interviews about kind of English beyond the educational context, and what value they saw in learning English, or English having English communication skills and English proficiency? What was like? How did they value those competencies, and what impact did that have on their motivation? Sort of looking just beyond getting through their university education, because I imagine in Colombia, it's English likely plays a somewhat limited role in the public sphere or in society. So I was just wondering if any of that came out in your studies, or how you engaged with that part of it.
Okay, so thanks for the question, Thomas. Yeah, I wanted to go beyond just looking at the economic value of English. So I looked at the research and looked at all the ways that English is claimed to contribute to development, and we've had claims that English promotes peace, is useful for getting foreign aid. But I took a critical perspective to this because, for example, the aid question in Colombia, foreign aid equals foreign interference. So I tried to kind of be very critical about whether English did contribute to other dimensions of human flourishing beyond the economic. What came out quite strongly was aspirations that they felt English would be useful to them in the future, because they wanted to either go and study in an English-speaking country or travel. But most of them hadn't done that. Yeah, so it was more aspirational than actual having a real value. Some of them mentioned identity, that it was an important part of their identity. Access to knowledge was another dimension. Being able to consume artistic and cultural products. So basically watching Netflix, but also, enjoying music. So there are a lot of dimensions that came out just beyond the economic. I'm not sure if I answered all of your question. Please feel free to interrupt me.
No, that's great. Thank you. No, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, no, thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. So we have a question from Sukaina.
Thank you, Melise. Love both the presentations, both from Sophia and also from Lee. And I like the way different frameworks were used to look at the study. So if I may, Melise, I'm going to ask questions to both of them. So for Sophia, you mentioned in your discussion that Year 9 were using noughts and crosses. Was there any opportunity where you could actually engage with the teachers and find how the teaching was very different when they were using a text from Shakespeare and a text from noughts and crosses? So that's a question for Sophia. And a question for Lee. Lee, you mentioned that you had to drop your accent at some point. So how did that actually come in terms of, did it affect your studies at all? So did you have to leave your accent in order to get on with the studies so that you can become an insider person? Or was it because you had your accent and you were seen as an outsider? Thank you.
Okay, I'll go first. Thanks for that, Sukaina. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly. Okay, so you asked how different it was when how the difference that teachers found in teaching, for example, noughts and crosses as opposed to Shakespeare. So what the teachers said when they spoke about texts such as noughts and crosses, they felt that students engaged better with it because they felt as if it was more modern for one, and then it dealt with different races, which, you know, similar to their race, similar to their context. While Shakespeare, you know, a lot of students didn't even understand the language. And one teacher even said, for some students who don't have like a Christian background, you know how some of the language in Shakespeare, like thou and art, if you read the Bible, it's a similar kind of language. So those students who were like Christians or read the Bible or that sort of thing, they related better, like they understood it better. They didn't have students saying, Miss, what is thou? What does that mean? And having to go through that kind of language. So yes, students were more engaged. And also Noughts and Crosses generated a lot of discussion because it turned the societal notion and what we thought on its head. You know, normally it's most novels had like whites being in a dominant situation, and in Noughts and Crosses it's not like that. So instantly students started to say, what's happening here, Miss? Why? And that created other discussions on race and also gender. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did, Sophia. Thank you. I mean, I enjoyed watching Noughts and Crosses. I really loved the costumes as well. So, because I was born in Kenya, so the costumes and the material that is used in I sort of wear those kinds of clothing as well. So for me, it was like I can see something that's really happening live as well. So thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Sukaina. I don't know, again, if that's the correct pronunciation. My accent, well, I come from a very working class background, and I was the first person in my family to go to university, and I studied English at university, which is not the typical subject somebody from a working class background would study, but I love books. And I realized that I don't know, I mean, I don't want to be presumptuous. I haven't read enough about this, but it seems to be quite a middle class subject. At least that was my impression when I did my English degree. And I found that I got a better response when I spoke more clearly and avoided using slang or Geordie terms. And I found that in dealing with, for example, customer services, I tend to get a better response. But this could just be my own low self-esteem. But and I think there's a lot of interesting research that could be done in that area, how accent affects your epistemic contribution or lack of. So hopefully somebody will start researching that, because I don't think I'm going to get around to it.
Thank you, Lee. I think what you mentioned is quite a lot, because accents do make an impact at times, and on my side as well, I find that sometimes if I don't really have a very high British accent, it can actually make an impact to the learners as well. So thank you, both Sophia and Lee. You did pronounce my name well. Thank you.
Thank you, Skyne, and thank you, Lee. And I'm glad to see that, Lee, you are going into some of this epistemic justice, literature or, like readings. Yeah, I'm glad that I'm getting into there. So we have a question from Peter in the chat. Peter, would you like to unmute yourself and ask directly to Sophia?
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. The question to Sophia really is, how do English teachers navigate the conflict between a drive towards non-discrimination in the classroom and the need to recognize the differences among students as they seek to learn English? And this is basically both English literature and English language.
Okay, thanks for that question, Peter. So one of the things that teachers said, they felt sometimes about that stereotypical, that they were being stereotyping. For example, you know, you don't want to be discriminatory to anyone. You want to be inclusive. However, their ideas before the research, they came into it thinking, okay, if I'm going to use intersectional practices, I'm going to be saying, okay, this is what we're going to do for boys, this is what we're going to do for girls, this is what we're going to do for SEN, and that could create disadvantage. But then throughout the questioning and the discussions, what came out was including intersectional practices is, in fact, focusing on everyone. It's not creating inequality, because yes, you do realize that, okay, so for example, let me give an example. If you're going to be teaching a topic around maybe sports, in an intersectional classroom, you would have topics focused on all types. You wouldn't be rigid and set. You'd also have pictures of girls being footballers, boys being footballers. You'd be having Olympics as well. So students with disabilities. So you're showing all the areas, all the ways to do it, and that opens it up more, makes it more inclusive, rather than thinking, okay, I'm only going to do football for boys, you know, and that one teacher did say that her way of doing it was, you know, she gave an example of her growing up, going to school and having a career as the teacher saying, oh, you're Black, so you can sing, you can do singing. And yes, she could sing, but she felt as if she was being put in a box just because of her race. So how do we open it up and ensure that it's more intersectional? That's the question. I hope I answered that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sophia. So I think we're coming into an end, but I saw that Lorena, you raised your hand. Do you still want to ask your question before I finish?
Hello. It was just a comment more than a question. I'm from Ecuador, and I can see that the linguistic issues between Colombia and in Ecuador are very similar. So maybe Lee, you are very appreciated there in Colombia, because as you are a native speaker, you could see that it's like students appreciate more native speaker teachers than for example, in my case here in Ecuador, students always ask for if they can have a native English, a native speaker in the English language. So for that reason is that maybe the Ecuadorian teachers feel like we are not well appreciated in our country. However, we are we are preparing more and more in teaching English. And I would like to know maybe if you have found a problem with the indigenous group in terms of equity or something like that when they learn English with the other students.
Muchas gracias por su pregunta, Lorena. Thank you for the question.
Gracias.
Yes, I mean, they're quite comparable in some. I also worked in Ecuador, so I kind of know a bit about the context. I mean, as you know, Ecuador has a larger indigenous population than Colombia. From about the 50 million Colombians, only about 1 million identify as indigenous. But the English language requirement is not lifted in many cases, even though they speak an indigenous language and Spanish, and therefore meet the criteria for what is called Columbia's push to bilingualism, they in addition have to learn English, which obviously disadvantages them, because living in indigenous communities, how useful is English to them? And the native speakerism, I'm just going to paste an article that I wrote about discriminatory advertisements. And it's amazing the amount of discrimination, not just in the global south, and I think it would be a mistake to categorize it as a problem that's just in the global south. I've seen native speakerism in Europe and in Asia, basically saying native speakers only. If you don't have a British passport or American passport, don't apply, which is just crazy that, you know, the UN condemned discrimination in, I think, 1952. And 70 years later, we are still discriminating against people on the basis of origin, with the argument that native speakers are somehow better. But this is the discourse of linguistic imperialism, which I cover in my thesis, which is very pervasive. So if you're interested in this, have a look at Robert Phillipson. He has 5 fallacies of English, and one of them is the native speaker fallacy, that the native speaker is somehow better. So I think it requires more people like yourself to challenge this dominant narrative.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lee. So I'll end the session here now. We're just slightly 10 minutes over the scheduled time, but I would like to say huge thanks and congratulations to Sophia and Lee for this fantastic session. And Lee, again, congratulations for your article, new article. I will just share now on our social media accounts, your article, so that everyone gets to read that. So thank you very much, everyone. This was the last session of our webinar series, and we will be seeing you next academic year, which will start in October. So until then, please take care, have a lovely summer or winter break wherever you are, and see you in October. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Already post the session, but it's a quick one, so.
So the question is, what role does culture play in the learning of English in higher education, and do you think that social media could impact English proficiencies? Yes, I think social media, it can impact, and I think that's something that needs to be explored more, because I haven't looked into it a lot, to be honest with you, but I think social media can have a big impact. Culture, well, I mean, I think it depends on which paradigm you're working within. A lot of typical teacher training for English teachers says that you should bring that cultural aspect in. But if English is the global language, why does it have to be tied to a particular place? That sounds a bit like the that German ideology that, the blood and land thing, that somehow language is tied to a certain place. And I don't think that's the case with English, and it shouldn't be. English has many uses, and the majority of people who speak English speak it as a second language rather than a first language. So why should and that's the wrong word to use, but why should the English of people like myself be the dominant form?
Yeah. Says thank you and congratulations on your presentation, Peter. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you very much, both of you. And I know that I'll be in touch with both of you individually. You just leave right before your Viva, and we'll just have a mock Viva and discuss through. I hope you're looking forward to that.
Yes.
Thank you, Melis, and congratulations on you to produce 2 wonderful PhD students. Make them speak today.
Exactly, and this was a really well-attended session too. I mean, it's always amazing how our PhD students' presentations are always well-attended. So
well done all.
Okay, have a lovely evening and so on.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you and bye.